Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 6, The 35th Day of Planting, Part 3 of 5. "How long will he keep this up?" Lilla whispered to Pato, seeing Shem staring listlessly. "He hasn't moved in hours." "I don't know." She covered her face with her hands, and Pato put an arm around her. "I know how he feels, and it's too much, Pato," she whimpered. "It's the worst maggoty day ever. Moldy fruit and rancid vegetables and weevils infesting the wheat. I just want to lay down and never get back up again." "Shh," he said, stroking her hair. "Mora and Sentia are already sure that's what's going to happen next. Everyone's so heavy right now. We need to be careful what we say in front of them." "Why, Pato?" Lilla sobbed softly. "Why so much? Why now? Why us?" "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore," he confessed. "We didn't do anything wrong, I'm sure. We're not being punished. Calla wasn't punished, nor was my mother." "It sure feels like it." "Shh, I know. He sighed and kissed her head. "Sometimes bad things just happen. Do we lose our faith when tragedy strikes? Seems to me that's when we need it the most." Lilla went limp in his arms. "I still have faith, just no joy left. I remember how I tried to comfort you after Perrin died." "I do too." "Well, I was wrong then, as heartless and wrong as jam on trout," she said with uncharacteristic bitterness. "There's no reason for joy, no reason to continue until the last day. It's all over for me. Just make it all end now. And where is he?" she wailed softly. Pato knew who she was whimpering about. "He could have made it by now." "He may have been trapped in the forest somewhere," Pato said, trying to console himself as much as her. "Maybe he was unable to get around the army until they moved. He might have gone north instead to go around the temple, then head to the west. If he did, that's 15 miles altogether, Lilla. He may have even seen what happened to my mother." He choked on the words. "If he did, how it's affecting him is anyone's guess. He may be sitting stunned, just like Shem." "He won't make it, Pato," Lilla muttered hopelessly. "There's no protection for us. There's no special help. Young Per will die alone and surrounded by evil, just like his grandmother and aunt." "You don't know that," Pato said, rocking his wife. "We don't know anything." "That's the worst part, Pato." Versa was hunched over, gripping her sides in agony, while tears streamed down her face. Young Per stood patiently next to her. "Do we need to find another shrub for you to squat behind?" Versa shook her head and gasped. "Or is it too late for that?" he asked tactfully. She burst out into another round of laughter and clutched the shawl support that was slipping down her hips. "No," she panted as she caught her breath. "Not yet, but I don't think I can take any more." With young Per's help, she finally righted herself. Young Per was grinning as he kept his hand on her arm to stabilize her. "Now, if only my family had reacted to my jumping off the school building the way you just did." "I mean," she said, wiping her eyes, "it's just so ridiculous. Oh, I'm as light as a bird and built like one too. I'm going to fly." "I can just see you trying to flap your pathetic little blanket wings. Did you have absolutely no sense at all?" Mugga had said something like that to him, and had made him furious at the time. Now he found himself grinning as he heard the same sentiment. "No, I guess I didn't. And I think I forgot to flap my arms. That might have been part of the problem," he contemplated. "But I like to believe I've learned a few things in the past 2 years." Wait, Versa gasped. "You weren't a child when you did this? How old were you?" Young Per braced himself and said, "Almost 18. She howled again. "I am walking with an idiot." He grinned. "I'll go find you a secluded shrub." "If you give them the night in the houses," began a major, I have another 700 men who'll join you in the morning. Not at the crack of dawn, though." It was after midday meal, and Thorne was furious. Major Twig added the number to the tally. "That'd be an even 45,000, sir." The major bringing the news had even more. "And the lieutenant colonel said he found another 400 that took over a section of houses on the eastern side. They'll agree to come if they're assured they can keep their houses." 45,400, Twig said encouragingly. A captain squirmed. "That group of 2,000 organizing near here, they're following Colonel Offra and some little old man back up the canyon. They laughed at me when I asked if they didn't rather want to join us for glory and honor in battle." Another lieutenant cleared his throat. "But I located another 2,000, sir, in a massive building filled with all kinds of clothing, furniture, tools, you name it. They want assurances they can keep everything they can carry." "Carry west?" Thorne finally spoke, bristling with rage. "On our attack?" The officer shrugged. "Apparently." "Would be 47,400, Twig pointed out. Thorne steamed. Now he was negotiating with soldiers for their services, and he was losing. "I can't believe your grandfather survived so much, only to die from an infection from a stick. I can understand why you were so upset about his passing," Versa remarked as they made their way through a meadow. The grasses were just starting to come up out of the slush. "Your inability to cope with your grief likely contributed to your stupidity." "Wow," young Pear said. "That almost sounded compassionate." "Guide Zena said I need to work on developing empathy toward men," she said with mock haughtiness. "Just practicing." Young Pear chuckled. "I still remember the first time I heard the name of Perrin Shin," Versa said with a small smile. "Is that good or bad?" young Pear asked. "Good, I promise. I was maybe 4 years old." She squinted, trying to remember. "We were living with Uncle and Aunt Foddy at the time. General Fod," she clarified. "After he took over the fort at Marsh, he built a house in the compound for his wife. When my mother ran away from Edge with the 3 of us, the Fods took us in. Uncle Foddy even added 2 bedrooms for us and put up a tall fence around the back garden of the house. We had a small yard to play in right there in the middle of the fort, with a barricade fence and the outer fort wall to protect us." "Sounds a little crowded," young Pear decided. "Oh, no," Versa sighed with a smile. "It was wonderful. True, we never left the house and the yard for those 4 years. In fact, I don't think that more than a few soldiers even knew we were there. Uncle Foddy had passed us off as his wife's cousins or something. But no one could see us because we're so pale and the Fods are so dark, it would have been obvious we weren't related." She chuckled. "But they took such good care of us. Uncle Foddy always came home for midday meal to play for a few minutes. Then each evening he'd tell us stories and even wrestle with us. He taught me some moves that I used later to get out of bad situations. He wanted us to be safe," she added heavily. "Aunt Foddy was like a second mother to me, letting me cook in the kitchen with her and sewing us clothing. They wanted to have children of their own but never could," she said sadly. "But for their last years, they had 3 blonde daughters." "So when did you hear the name of Perrin Shin?" young Pear reminded her. "I'm getting to that," she snapped, annoyed that he interrupted her happy memory. "One day we had a visitor who was allowed to come into the back part of the house to see us. He was another commander, shorter, lighter skinned than the Fods, but his face was harder, rougher. I remember the look in his eyes when he saw the 3 of us. I couldn't tell if he was angry or sad, because he seemed to be both. He was carrying a large crate and he put it down on the floor in front of us. When he opened the lid, it was the greatest day. There were dolls." Versa laughed quietly at the recollection. "I didn't even know those existed until that day. One for each of us, made from soft cloth and yarn hair, and with beautifully stitched faces. There were even changes of clothes for the dolls. Mine had a skirt made of silk, That was the first time I ever touched silk, and it was just for me. Under the dolls were books, simple ones to start learning to read, and another one filled with easy math problems. They were so we could start learning at home without having to go to the schools. My mother wept. I didn't understand why she did that at the time. I thought they were lovely gifts. But my mother was weeping out of gratitude, I realized later. Someone else in a uniform was worried about her and her children. She thanked the commander, but he just shook his head and said something like, "The dolls were made by my wife, and the books were easy to come by in the South. I'm just doing what Perrin Shin would have done. Every good thing I learned from Perrin Shin." "Who was that commander?" young Per asked. "His name was Brillin Karna," Versa said reverently. "Your grandfather's first lieutenant, I found out later." "He served with him for over 15 years, if I remember correctly," young Per added. "He came 2 more times while we were living with the Fods," Versa recalled. "Once he brought more clothes for our dolls, and clothes for us. He also brought more books, and once he had a small crate full of sweets and candy. He kept saying it was his wife's doing and Perrin Shin's, whoever that man was. But still, I hugged General Karna to thank him. It was obvious he wasn't used to small children hugging him, and he stiffened up each time I did it. But the last time I saw him, his eyes were filled with tears as if he knew he'd never see us again." The world was getting worse then. Her voice diminished to a whisper. The end was coming for both of those dear generals and their kind, generous wives. My Aunt Foddy, she taught me to read and helped me learn how to add and subtract. She was such a good friend to my mother, and I'd hear them laughing as if they were truly sisters. Aunt Foddy fed us all, dressed us, and loved us as if we were really her own." Her tone shifted as she said, "And then Sargon's army came." She hesitated, and young Per remained silent. He'd learned this part of history in his training. Sargon had brought up his army to join with Fods as a pretext of fighting off Snide, who was in charge of the western factions. Only now did young Per remember that General Snide had been Versa's mother's uncle. Who Versa's mother felt she could trust in those days must have been quite perplexing. But Sargon instead killed Fod in the heat of battle. No one believed it was an accident. And the next day, Fod's wife was running from the fort when she was cut down by Sargon's men. Versa and her mother and sisters must have still been hiding in the compound. Young Per realized why Versa so hated Sargon. "When we escaped from the fort," Versa started again somberly, "it was in such a hurry that we had to leave behind the dolls and books. I wondered frequently who Perrin Shin was, and if maybe he couldn't find us or send us help." Young Per didn't know what to say. Finally he came up with, "I'm sorry no one came." "Ah, but they did," she smiled. "Otherwise I wouldn't be in Salem now or walking with Perrin Shin himself." She nodded to young Per. "Somehow I have a feeling he sent you as well. When I was younger, I thought of this mysterious Perrin Shin as some sort of a distant grandfather who knew we were hurting and wanted to help us." Young Per swallowed at the veracity of that thought. Some sort of distant grandfather? "But later, once I understood about the Creator," Versa continued, "I realized that's who I was really longing for. An eternal Father who always kept his eye on us. And he did," she said quietly. "And he is, right now." "I almost feel like we're spying on them," Mari said in a low voice to her husband. They walked hand in hand several paces behind young Per and Versa, smiling as they listened to the two of them talking. "Kind of like what we did to Jatsi and Dek when they were courting. I almost feel a little guilty." Perrin smiled. "This isn't spying, this is guarding. We're guarders, after all." He gestured to those ahead of them. Versa had no idea that on her left were the Fods, smiling in remembrance of when they had 3 blonde little girls, or that to the right of young Per were the Karnas, chuckling that Brillin was so uncomfortable with little girls hugging him. Ahead were another set of Shins, an imposing general named Relf and his wife Joriana, arm in arm, completing the bubble that enclosed Versa and Young Pair, and repelled soldiers that none of them even dared to think to get within 50 paces. "So," Mari elbowed her husband gently, "you admit we were spying on Jatsi and Dek all those years ago?" Perrin sighed. "Yes, I have to confess we were spying. But this is different. We're supposed to be watching and directing the protection." Mari grinned. "I like this complete honesty of yours. All kinds of things I can ask you about now, and the laws of paradise won't let you evade the truth," she chuckled. "So tell me, you're not enjoying this just a little bit? Tailing our grandson, watching him watching her, watching her watching him?" Perrin smiled uneasily. He knew he couldn't dance around this one, as if he ever danced. "Paradise is supposed to be a place of joy. Of course I'm allowed to enjoy this a bit. After what we've been through in the last 7 seasons, I think we've earned this lovely stroll." He put his arm around Mari and pulled her closer. She rested her head against him. "Just so that you finally admit you were spying on Jatsi and Dek." Perrin growled. "What in the world?" Versa said. "Or rather, in Salem?" And she paused to squint between the trees. Young Pair halted next to her, and tensed when he saw the soldier on the other side of the trees 40 paces away. He wondered if he could slip Versa's long knife from her hip quickly enough, until he realized the soldier wasn't interested in them. What is he carrying? "From what I can tell," Versa tilted her head, 3 hammers, a few fire starters, something incredibly heavy in a bag. I'd say he's trying to become the first traveling blacksmith. I wonder where he stowed his anvil." Young Pair chuckled. "And he's in a hurry." Versa nodded. "No doubt he's intending to take all of that back to the world to start his own blacksmithing business." "So you really think he's going to take all of that over the mountains?" "Of course not," said Versa. "Look at his gut. He's already panting from all that weight. No, I predict that he'll drop all of that in about a quarter of a mile, realize that yarn is much lighter, and decide that knitting is a very acceptable craft for a man of his belly." Young Pair was snorting so much he had to wipe his nose. Sure enough, the portly soldier was already slowing down, huffing and reevaluating if he really needed so many hammers. He dropped one, shrugged at it, and continued on his lumbering jog south. Young Pair just laughed. It felt so good, and he wished Versa would say something else caustic, even if it were aimed at him, just to give him more reasons to laugh. She grinned at him. "Anyone ever tell you your laugh sounds like bells?" "Well, sort of," he said. "That's because you're a ding-a-ling." Young Pair laughed again. Beavid automatically drew his sword as the man bounded from the trees, headed straight for them. The rest of the team pulled their weapons too. "I promise I mean no harm," Cloudman shouted as he raised his hands and stopped. "I'm so glad I found you. I don't know what happened, but I was looking at these clouds and then—" Beavid scoffed. "No harm? You're a slagging assassin." Cloudman halted, stunned. "I'm a what? Why would you say such terrible things about—" "General Thorne told me." Beavid tilted his head. "Lieutenant Nelt." The innocent gleam in Nelt's eye vanished. "Oh, I see." His tone changed completely. "Look, I'm not an assassin. Well, not an official one. I never took the oaths or completed the training." "Then you're a traitor!" Buddy shouted, his arm trembling as he held his sword outstretched. "That's worse." Nelt sighed, not at all convinced that the pimply-faced boy could harm him, nor could his pal, cowering bravely behind him. "I know, and you're right. But look, I'm here now, and I'm not with Thorne. Doesn't that mean something?" Teach folded his arms, his long knife still clutched in his fist. "According to the Assassin's Code, that means you're looking for the next best opportunity. And we're it. You must be desperate." Reg glanced at Teach. "How do you know about the Assassin's Code?" "I'm a teacher. he said easily. I know a little about everything. After a pause, he added in a whisper, and I couldn't pass their final tests. Reg's eyes widened with new respect and worry. I'll take care of our cloudy Nelt, Hammer offered, cracking his knuckles. No one else needs to be bloodied. He took a few steps, and Nelt retreated, waving his arms. No, I promise, no one needs to be bloodied. What about Shin? Beavid barked. Where's his body? How soon after you freed him did you kill him? He's not dead, Nelt exclaimed. In fact, that's what I've been trying to do, keep him alive. I secured him to a tree last night to keep him from attacking Thorn. Shin was ready to kill him. So was I, Iron said. Snarl snarled. Nelt waved his arms again as if to fend them off. And so am I promise. You don't kill unarmed great-grandmothers, no matter what their names. I gave Thorn the slip, then went back late last night to find Shin. The tree he was secured to was broken. I've been looking for him all day, and I think I've seen him, on his way to the western mountains. He was walking with a Salemite woman, someone who seems to know him, maybe a sister or a cousin. Look at me, Nelt said. No sword, and look here. He started to open his jacket, and each of the men tightened his grip on their weapons. Nelt gestured to the inside of his empty jacket. I threw my small crossbow into the river along with everything else. I came to you willingly, unarmed, begging your forgiveness, and wanting to help Shin. Pat me down if you need to. I want nothing more to do with Thorn or any of this. I just want to find Shin, apologize, and get to safety, just like all of you. Why don't you go to Shin now? Beavid said. Nelt swallowed. I don't think he'd want to see me just now. Iron cracked his knuckles. I wonder why. No, I mean Shin was actually laughing with that woman he was walking with. I don't remember ever hearing him laugh. Not much to laugh about lately, Teach reminded him. I know, Nelt nodded, and it didn't seem right to interrupt that, but we can't find him again, I'm confident. Please, I regret deceiving you and Shin, but I don't regret preserving his life. Eventually he'll see that it was the best thing to do, and he'll forgive me. I'm sure of it. Can you forgive me? Beavid evaluated him and finally sighed. Well, think about it. Hammer, Iron, pat him down first, he smiled slyly, and do a very thorough job of it. Nelt gulped. By the time they reached the field before the trailhead, Versa knew nearly every story about young Pear's mischievous childhood and his experiences in the world. Almost every worldly experience. Young Pear had watched her every time he explained how he was stupid, foolish, or downright reckless. Each time she nodded, labeled the action, then gave him an almost forgiving smile. So I suppose it's a miracle you haven't needed a doctor while we've been walking, she remarked. No wonder you know so much medically. Maybe today's just a day of miracles for us. I haven't even had the urge to climb a tree or start a fire. Maybe you're just growing up, she suggested. He looked at her in mock dismay. Me become an adult? My, will the miracles never cease, he said with a grand gesture. So often my family thought they'd never see me reach maturity. Maturity and growing up are two very different things, Versa pointed out. I think you still have a ways to go to be considered mature. Young Pear chuckled. Yeah, you're definitely something else, Versa. I still haven't figured out just what exactly, but I suggest we rest here for a time. He pointed to some fallen logs. The trailhead is just beyond that field in front of us, and it might be best for you to eat before we continue on. It's only mid-afternoon, but now's as good a time as any for dinner. What makes you think I still have something to eat? Versa sat down on a log and propped up her feet on another one. You're an expecting woman. I've never met an expecting woman who doesn't travel with a pack full of food. Versa squinted at him. Sure you've never posed as an expecting woman before? She took her pack from him, opened it, and smiled as she pulled out bread and dried fruit. She held some out to young Pear. I'm fine until we reach the site. He waved it off. You need it. I have plenty, she insisted. And you're right. I've packed enough for days. Have you really? She chuckled. Yes, please eat. I even restocked at a house yesterday. I may need your strength as well if I get too tired. You won't do me any good if you're lightheaded with hunger. Young Pear sighed and reluctantly took what she offered. Thank you. Besides, she said, we should be able to restock at that emergency shelter on the trail if we need to, right? He frowned as he took a bite of bread, wondering if he should give it back. We never had an emergency shelter on that route. We kind of neglected it. It was just an afterthought route. Do you want this back? He held out the bread. Versa gave him a slightly pained smile. Not at all. I have enough. See? She opened the pack to show him several more items wrapped in cloth and tied with string. We'll be fine for another day and a half, but we'll be at the ancient site well before then, right? If all goes well and we have no delays, we should be there by tonight, he said, taking another bite. Tonight would be good, she sighed. If I weren't so out of shape, we could have made much faster time. Before the baby, I could have run half this distance. Instead, I've been waddling like a goose and panting like a dog, and it just seems to be getting worse. I'm sorry. We're fine, he assured her. We have plenty of time. The only thing I'm worried about is you. It's been quite a distance to go for a woman in your condition. Versa turned a little pink when he said that he was worried about her, and she became interested in a handful of raisins. After a while, she said, I've been thinking about what I said to you when we first met, about your grandmother. I realize now that it must have sounded jarring, my talking about the way she went. That's all right, he said. You didn't know then that she was my grandmother. I really did admire her, you know, and she was wonderful when I met her. It's just that the stupid general— I noticed that you always call him the general, young Pear interrupted. She glared at him. Did you ever want to call him father? No, he chuckled bitterly. You're right. You know, Versa, you remind me of my mugga. She always said exactly what she thought, and she didn't care how others took it. She only wanted to say what she was sure was right, even if she was wrong, which really wasn't that often now that I think about it. Versa chewed on a dried apple. I'm not sure. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Yes, it is. Although many times today you have, well, let's just say you have a humbling way about you. Versa chuckled. Well then, I thank you, and I'm sorry for the other times. I'm supposed to be working on that. I've been told I can be too critical, she added quietly. They ate in silence until Versa offered, My mother always called me the general. My sister said it was because I was so bossy and always took charge, but my mother usually called me that in a pleased sort of way. I think many times I helped carry her burdens because I refused to give up and didn't have patience for anyone who did. I can see that, he said. I would have loved to seen you take on General Thorne. You just might have won him over if you had the opportunity. Versa took another piece of dried apple and eyed it suspiciously, as if it were her father. I doubt he even would have spoken to me. Last night I finally had a whole speech prepared in my mind, but I knew the Creator didn't want me to see him. I was always a few steps behind him, never able to catch up or trapped by his stupid well. Young Pear's eyebrows furrowed, wondering what that meant. She didn't elaborate. It's all right, though. I see now how everything has happened as it should. I feel some regret that I didn't listen more carefully, and now I'm burdening you with getting me to safety. You're no burden, young Pear told her, and I'll get you there, I promise. But he wasn't so sure how to fulfill that promise. As he scanned the terrain, looking for the best way to cross, he couldn't help but notice several soldiers in the field, looking lost and nervous, and all of them still armed. He sighed a prayer, asking for ideas as he watched soldiers eyeing each other for food or worse. "They won't see us," Versa broke into his thoughts. "What?" he asked, turning back to look at her. His chest tightened again, as it had several times that day when he looked into her clear blue eyes. Somehow they had gentled over the past few hours, softening her entire face. "The soldiers, I know you're worried. It's about 100 paces to the trailhead, right? Trust me, they won't see us." Young Pear sat down across from her on another log. "We're not exactly inconspicuous," he said, nodding at her belly. She rolled her eyes, reminding him that he was an idiot. "Don't you remember what I told you? How often soldiers missed seeing us? Don't you have any faith?" "I do. I have faith." "Then ask for a miracle," she insisted. "I have been," he said. "That no one's bothered us in the past several hours is a miracle." "I agree. So why should the miracles stop now?" "It's not that I don't think we won't be helped." He tried to explain his thoughts, which hadn't figured themselves out yet. "It's just that I also know the Creator expects us to do our part. I'm looking for ways He would want me to act to get you to safety. To be honest, I'm not so sure any of the miracles we experienced are for me. They are for you, Ursula Thorne." Versa squinted at him. "For me? No, they're for you, Perrin Shin. Do you have any idea how many people have been praying for you?" Young Pear guiltily looked down at his hands, but lifted his gaze to Versa's belly. "I know who the miracles are for." He gestured to her stomach. Versa ran a hand over it and readjusted the shawl. "I think you're right. And the greatest miracle is still to come, finding her a father who can love her." She sighed and stared off at the mountain they'd soon have to scale. "I want to find a man like Guide Zenas. He's been so good to me and my family. He's treated us like we're his. I finally know what a father is supposed to be like. I want her to have someone like him. Or like your father," she said with a slight blush, "for the same reasons." Young Pear smiled gently. "You think it's a girl?" Versa shrugged. "With my mother's history, what else could it be?" Young Pear chuckled, and he watched her belly shift. Knowing it was an awkward question, but still intrigued, he said, "May I?" Versa hesitated before nodding. He gently placed his hand on her belly, the baby slowly shifting underneath his touch. "She's active. That's a good sign." But Versa grimaced. "So I've been told, but right now it feels like she's trying to kick her way out through my back." Young Pear patted her belly until the baby's rolling slowed. Versa laughed quietly. "I think she actually feels you patting her." "My Uncle Shem would do that," Young Pear explained. "So often the unborn babies in our families would become active when he was around. I think they could feel who he was and were excited to be around the Creator's guide. Then he'd pat them and say, 'Give your poor mother a rest, will you?'" Versa smiled and watched Young Pear's hand continue to pat her belly until the baby was still again. She placed her hand on top of his. "Thank you," she whispered. "As I was kneeling by the river this morning, I wasn't just getting a drink. I was pleading for help. I had no idea what to do next." Young Pear stared at her hand on top of his. She slid it off, and he, feeling embarrassed at his forwardness and her forwardness, and forwardness in general, quickly withdrew his hand from her belly as if it were on fire. He sat back, well out of touching distance, before he dared to look up into her face, which struck him as more beautiful every time he gazed at her. Still, he thought he sounded quite casual when he said, "It's been my pleasure. Besides, it feels right to be around expecting women again. I've missed seeing children and families." Versa turned pink again and looked down. Young Pear touched her foot to get her attention. "Tell you what, I'll help you with the next miracle when we get to the site." Versa frowned. "Next miracle?" "Yes, finding you that most wonderful husband and father Salem can offer." Versa tilted her head. "Oh, really?" Young Pear nodded, trying to understand why his cheeks were growing hot and red. You should have someone who can really appreciate you. I already have someone in mind. Now Versa was blushing. Who? My cousin Cephas Brighter, he said. There's no one more faithful or strong than him. Because maybe she wasn't his half-cousin. But even if she were, that'd still be all right, wouldn't it? He knew of a few cousins in Salem who had married, and their children were fine and healthy, and Versa might be only half-cousin. She was staring blankly at him, and he realized he needed a stronger pitch. Cephas was always the man I should have been. Everything I should have done, he did. He's the perfect son, sober, thoughtful, and the best example. And, he sighed heavily, I'm going to have to confess all of that to him when I finally see him again. He'd be perfect for you. When he saw Versa's knitted eyebrows, he added, and I've been told he's even better looking than me. Versa snorted a laugh. Young Pear grinned. I guess I haven't humbled you completely yet. Yes, I know who Cephas is. He accompanied your father a few times. He favors your uncle. Young Pear had to remind himself she was referring to Dick. But with more hair. I suppose he is rather handsome, she said thoughtfully. Although on the quiet side, so I'd always get my say in. But what makes you think he's still available? And somehow that simple question knocked Young Pear like a timber upside the head, and thousands of previously unconsidered thoughts piled up on top of him like an avalanche. I hadn't thought of that, he whispered. He could already be married. It has been almost 2 years after all. Wow, He hadn't considered anything, he had to admit to himself. Earlier, he was struck with the idea that he'd been the most detestable shin in Salem. While he hoped that wasn't the case anymore, he had to face the fact that no one would be the same as they were. You know, a lot may have changed, he mused out loud. Little kids growing bigger. Maura would be 9 years old now. My sister Heisey married right before I left. What if she's a mother now? I missed it. And my cousin Salima was just as big as you when I took off. I don't even know what kind of baby she had. It's probably already walking and talking. She was really hoping for a girl. She already had 2 boys. He broke off his rambling to cover his face with his hands. Versa sat in silence, waiting. When Young Pear composed himself again, he whispered, Ralph asked me last year if I wanted to know about the new romances. Maybe he was talking about Cephas, or Zadok finally found someone who could put up with him. I missed it all. That last realization bubbled up around him like a suffocating river, trying to swallow him up, smothering him with despair. The hand squeezing his arm caused him to open his eyes. Versa was kneeling in front of him. It doesn't matter, Young Pear, she whispered earnestly. You can fix it. You can get to know everyone again. You can't dwell on what is lost. I know because I've tried. All you can do is look to the future and think about how great it will be. Young Pear felt his eyes dribbling tears, and he clumsily wiped them. Versa was fishing a gray cloth out of her bag, but he tried to dry his face before she could hand it to him. You're right, he sniffled. You know, I think I've said that a lot today. Versa ventured a smile. That I'm right? I've noticed that too. Those are a woman's favorite words, you know. Young Pear couldn't help but scoff a chuckle as she wiped away a stray tear he missed. No matter what she said, she had a way of making him want to laugh. And here I thought a woman's favorite words were, I love you. Versa pretended to ponder that, but Young Pear noticed her cheeks growing pink again. I love you is good, she decided, but you're right might be even better. You know, Young Pear, you already have the makings of a... His chest tightened again as she looked up into his eyes, and this time the blush in her cheeks was unmistakable. She must have felt it, because she quickly backed away and sat down on her log again. But young Pear wasn't about to let her off that easy. "I'm sorry, what were you saying? I have the makings of a what?" Versa pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing, but her cheeks nearly glowing red. "I'll tell you later, maybe." She repositioned herself. While young Pear wanted to continue this line of teasing, or maybe even flirting, he wasn't sure what was happening between them. He couldn't help but notice her discomfort. He'd been around too many expecting women in his family. "How often are you feeling that?" "Feeling what?" "The pain?" Versa stared at him. "I know what you're suggesting, but it's constant pain. All of this has been a little much today, as you might imagine, and it's catching up to me now, that's all." "Are you sure? Absolutely sure?" "Yes. Besides, it's in my back." Young Pear sighed. "That's where birthing pains often start. If the pains increase and decrease at regular intervals, you need to tell me." When she only examined her chunk of bread again, he prodded her with, "So, when do you think you're due?" Versa shrugged, nibbling on the crust. "It doesn't matter. We're going in the right direction, correct?" He knew an avoidance answer when he heard it. He practically invented them. "Versa," he repeated, leaning toward her. "When?" "I have plenty of time," she met his eyes. "Several weeks still." Young Pear leaned back against a tree and sighed in relief. "You don't really look too big, either," he said diplomatically. "But still, your belly could get in the way. That route right there, the back door, it's not going to be easy. We could take an easier route, but that would be another half-day's walk through the forest to get there. And I don't want you to risk suddenly doing something." "I've heard about the back door. It's supposed to be the fastest way. I'm not birthing here," she insisted. "I promise." While she looked him solidly in the eyes, he could tell she was keeping something back. He kneeled in front of her and put his hands on her belly again. "It's not exactly up to you, you know. Nature has a way of doing things when it's ready. I noticed earlier," and he gently pressed on her bulge, "you're very tight." "I've always been in excellent shape, so of course it's tight," she exclaimed. "I mean firm," he said. "Birthing pain firm." "And how would you know?" "I always felt my sisters' and cousins' bellies when they were expecting," he said, still holding her. "Kind of a weird family tradition to see whose touch the baby responds to. The women in our family would get desperate near the end of their terms. My Aunt Calica put her hands on someone's belly, and if it was a girl, it would be born the next day. But it didn't work for boys. So, beginning with my cousin Selima's first expecting, each of the men would put their hands on the expecting mother's belly, trying to convince the baby it was time to be born. My sister Jory's son was born the night after I held her belly, but I could feel her belly was already tightening. Still, everyone in the family thought maybe I had something to do with it. So I became an official belly holder." He smiled faintly at the tradition he'd forgotten about. But Versa raised her eyebrows at him and glanced down at his hands. "If they were right, then maybe you better stop touching me." He hadn't realized he was still holding her belly, and his hands flew off it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" She caught his arm and smiled forgivingly. "I promise. I'll tell you if I feel anything. In the meantime, I'm still in good condition, and I can handle anything that's coming our way. Tell me more about the route so I can prepare." Young Pear sat back down again, still a little surprised at himself for holding her for so long. He shook out his shoulders and turned to point to the field. "After we cross that, we enter between the two trees that are slashed like bear claw markings." "I think I see it," Versa nodded. "And then?" Young Pear squinted. "Yes, you can see it, can't you? We hadn't marked that one since I was probably 12. They must have marked it again after I left." And not for the first time that day, he felt a wave of hope. "Then we follow the markings on the trees for about 2 miles, It's a gentle climb all the way to a river. We cross the river, and that's where the fun begins. We climb up a steep trail for about a couple hundred paces, then it's up a rock face for about another 200 paces. There are grassy parts on either side of the rock, but it's too steep an incline to climb without slipping. I know, we've tried. The rock goes all the way to the top of the mountain. It dips down there as a kind of saddle, but it leads right to the temple site. Once you're at the saddle, it's a nice little stroll from the top of the mountain through the trees for a few dozen paces, and you're there. Doesn't sound too bad, mostly, Versa said, looking across the field. Tell me more about that rock face. Young Pear sighed. That's what I'm worried about for you. It's rather steep, but if you keep leaning forward, you can pretty much just crawl up it. There are a lot of natural handholds. I even did it back when I was 6 or 7. Just a little difficult to balance at times. Versa stared at the mountain, challenging her. I am forward heavy right now, she acknowledged. Let's just do it. It seems like the most logical way to go. Are you sure? Young Pear asked, trying to read her face. She looked over at him. Will you help me? He smiled broader than he meant to. Absolutely. Then I'm sure I can make it. And we should probably go now, she said, struggling to stand up. Young Pear got to his feet, took her arms, and pulled her up. I can get up myself, she said, as she looked up into his face. He knew he was standing a little too closely, but he didn't feel like stepping back yet. But thank you, anyway, she added. You're not used to someone trying to take care of you, are you? Young Pear said softly, aware that he was still holding her arms on the pretext of making sure she didn't topple over. Versa shifted her gaze to the west. Any plans for crossing the field, or do we just start walking? Feeling the same embarrassment as before, Young Pear released her arms and turned to look at the field. Filled with confidence he was sure was given him by the General of Salem, he announced, It's all right. We can do this. He picked up her bag and eagerly slung it over his shoulder. Let's go. Gripping her hand, he pulled her out of the shelter of the forest and into the field. They walked as quickly as they could, straight through the field to the marked trees. Young Pear firmed his grip on Versa's hand as 2 soldiers looked at their direction, then, suddenly distracted, turned to go another way. It happened again and again. Soldiers noticing them, soldiers abruptly turning away. Versa stumbled a bit, but did her best to keep up. When she tripped again, Young Pear stepped closer and wrapped an arm around her back. We could just go a little slower, she panted. No, we can't. Come on. We're almost there. Young Pear, I just can't move that fast. Yes, you can, he insisted, feeling an urgent need to get her out of sight of the soldiers. Keep going. He rushed her to the trees with the slashes and nearly dragged her in between them. He didn't stop until they were deep in a thicket of trees. I need a minute, Young Pear, Versa panted. Let me sit. He looked around and, satisfied they weren't followed, directed her to a stump where she sat down hard, holding her belly and breathing heavily. Young Pear continued to scan the trees. Sorry about that. You all right? He asked her, not looking back but watching the field to make sure no one was coming in after them. Yeah, I'm fine. See anything out there? Yes, he said. About a dozen soldiers, maybe more, and they're looking for something. I'd guess the houses around here have already been raided and they don't know where else to go. Versa, I hate to say it, but we need to move and move quickly. I'm feeling a bit anxious. He turned to look back at her. Her face was calm as she nodded. Well then, let's get going. Young Pear took her by the arms and pulled her up. Sure you're all right? Yes. Now, we're looking for the next slashes, right? She said, stepping in front of him and walking. Yes, he fell in behind her. 30 paces northwest. I'm not sure how many paces we ran into here, but we should see the next markings relatively soon. I want to find them, she said. How about I lead and you stay behind me? You can hear if anything is following us, and I can practice my tree deciphering skills. Young Pear shrugged. You're the general." She glanced behind her with a scowl, and young Pear chuckled. She marched into the woods, counting. "It's going to have to be enough, General." Major Twig looked at the fields beyond the station, just in case someone else with a message showed up. But all was quiet that afternoon. "We have almost 50,000 committed to follow you tomorrow morning." Thorne stared, his voice unnaturally calm as he considered the reduction of his forces by 1/3. "Where's Healy?" "Barn, sir. Did you want him?" Thorne shook his head. "Poe used to be close to Mari Shin. I think all he remembers right now is his former teacher. He needs time to remember her as the traitor to the administrators. He also helped Croup on occasion. I suppose he thought of him as a friend or something." Twig realized that was the first time Thorne, or anyone for that matter, had even mentioned Leonard Croup. As soon as he had died yesterday, he'd been forgotten. Twig also realized then that no one had bothered to recover his body to give it a proper burial. The guide of the Creator wasn't important enough, apparently. "Healy may be troubled about losing the foolish man," Thorne was saying, "even though Leonard deserved what he got. Let Healy pout tonight in the barn. By tomorrow morning, he will be mine again." And that is the end of part 3 of 5 of chapter 6, the 35th day of planting. Thank you.